Linux is kinda like Doom. Follow along with me, it's gonna make sense. If it has the ability to compute, at some point, somewhere in history, somebody's gonna try to run both Doom and Linux on it. Now, it's probably not gonna be good. It's probably not gonna be worth doing. However, Linux running on a calculator, personally, I think is really cool, even though it's not a good idea and no one's ever actually going to use it. Now, why are we talking about this? Well, alongside the Linux kernel, finally, after this being an RFC for about a year now, actually getting ready to drop support for the i486 CPU. This is following dropping support for the i386 about a decade earlier. There was a complete opposite thing also happening. Really old hardware gaining additional support. The Sega Dreamcast. Because, in case you didn't know, yes, you can run Linux on the Sega Dreamcast. Linux sees fixes for its GD-ROM driver in 2026 for the Sega Dreamcast. GD-ROM is the proprietary optical disc format used on the Dreamcast and a few other Sega devices for storing more data than CD-ROM at the time. To much surprise this morning on the Linux channel mailing list, there were a set of fixes to deal with the block I/O and capacity settings with the GD-ROM driver. With current Linux releases, a kernel oops would occur, basically a kernel error would occur and render an unusable drive. But with the two patches, a disk can mount, and you are able to make use of the inserted media. So that got me intrigued. That got me thinking, what about Linux on other game consoles? Because there's this whole big homebrew and console hacking scene. So my assumption would be, if people are hacking consoles, somebody at some point is gonna try to run Linux on it. And, well, yes. Yes, they will. So, got me thinking, hey, how old do these ports get? What is the oldest console with a port? What is the newest console with a port? And what are some weird standouts along the way? Let's start with what I thought was the easy question. What is the oldest console with a Linux port? I thought it was easy, and then I realized there's a bunch of really bad information. So, my first thought here was, okay, it probably could theoretically be possible on an old cartridge-based system. However, a lot of these devices had pretty bad specs, and obviously running Linux off of a cartridge, unless you're gonna solder everything onto the cartridge, or there was a way to load things from a micro SD card, probably was not gonna happen. That doesn't mean there haven't been attempts, however. So there are videos like this here. Linux running on an NES, question mark. Now the question mark there is doing a lot of work, because this isn't Linux. This is not Linux at all. It's another really old, really lightweight Unix-like operating system. It's also not running on an NES, somewhere in this video. It is running on a Famicom with a floppy drive. So it's kinda an NES, sorta, and it's kinda Linux, but not really. Also, there are weird projects like playing SNES games on an NES, but those are doing it with things like a Raspberry Pi, and then effectively using the NES as a really bad GPU. Also, doesn't really count. Yes, technically, I guess you could argue maybe that's a way to do it. I'm not gonna count that. I don't think anyone's reasonably gonna count that. What you would expect from Linux on the device is the device itself is actually running Linux. This guy has another video, Linux running on NES, but for real this time, which is closer to Linux. Again, it depends on how you define Linux. So this is a hyper stripped down version of Linux called Embeddable Linux Kernel Subset. This does not have most of what the modern kernel has, and is designed specifically to run on CPUs that were never supported by the kernel, okay? This is years earlier than what the kernel first supported. Do you count that as Linux? That's up to you. I personally don't, for the sake of what we're talking about here. I'm specifically focused on regular Linux. My next thought then was, what about the disc-based consoles? Not the PlayStation 1, not the Sega Dreamcast. The PlayStation 1 especially is very important to our story. I mean the ones that came before that. The 3DO interactive multiplayer from 1993. The Amiga CD32, also from 93. The Fujitsu FM Towns Marty from 1994. The Bandai Playdia quick interactive system, also 1994. And of course, the Sega CD from 1991, and we cannot forget the very first disc-based system, more like attachment for an existing system, the CD-ROM attachment from 1988 for the TurboGrafx-16, otherwise known as the PC Engine. And yes, CD-ROM is the official pronunciation, not CD-ROM squared, not CD-ROM 2, CD-ROM. I've done my searching, and as should be expected because of the hardware, because of when Linux was actually first initially made, I have not been able to find anything. Now, maybe there is a private repo somewhere, maybe somebody has worked on something that has been lost to history. I don't think any of those exist. So, if you are somebody who wants to go and try and get Linux running on a console from 1991, it seems like free real estate. Go ahead and try it. See if you can make it happen. Let's instead, though, move up to something like the PlayStation 1 from 1994. Now, as you should expect, I've been mentioning it a number of times. This is a very different story, because from what I can tell, there are two related and long-dead projects for the PlayStation 1. The first one I'll mention is PS1 Linux. Linux for the original Sony PlayStation 1. This is actually a fork of another project, and you'll notice throughout the commit history, mentions of something known as Runix or Runix. I'm gonna go with Runix because Linux? I don't know. Either way, if you go to the Console Mods Wiki, go to the PlayStation 1 section on Linux, you will come across this. While not as useful today, one can compile and run Linux on their PlayStation 1. An older project from a Czech company called Blockman Trading made a port of Linux called Runix for the PlayStation 1. It's based on the now way old Linux 2.4 kernel that is from 2001 and has supposedly support for the memory unit storage, multi-memory unit support up to 4 for more storage, and a USB port connected to a special board they made connected on the PIO port, based on the SL811HIC RTC support as well, possibly by all means of additional hardware connected to the PIO port. So far, we can make and run the kernel, sources and or memory unit images are missing, and we cannot boot into a file system as of yet. So, both of these projects were left in a kind of existing but unfinished state. So maybe if you wanted to work on something that actually could possibly go somewhere, this might be a better place to go from. And from what I can tell, this does appear to be the oldest console with a Linux port. Not a completely functional port, but a port that was at least some of the way there. Again, that is unless you count the NES version, which I'll leave that up to you. There actually was a cartridge-based console in that same generation, from Nintendo, the Nintendo 64, and being a much more powerful console than what you had with the NES, I skipped over a couple of details, because it did come out in 96, so it did come out after the PlayStation 1, but it also turns out that there is a psycho out there that worked on porting the Linux kernel over to the N64. This is something that was upstreamed into the kernel, or at least attempted to be upstreamed, and there are demos of this running. So, if you want to play around with it, you can do so. You shouldn't. It's gonna be really slow. but it does exist. If you go to Google right now and look up the oldest console with a Linux port, it is just going to straight up lie to you. As we've already established, probably the PlayStation 1. Microsoft Xbox from 2001. No. It's actually so not true that it's not even the first console in its generation with a Linux port. We'll get to the PlayStation 2 in just a bit. However, I do want to talk briefly about the Xbox port because it was a weird case. It made sense to run Linux on an Xbox. Why did it make sense? Well, like modern consoles, it wasn't anything special. It was basically a custom board computer. It ran a custom Pentium 3. It had fairly regular specs for the time. It had an NVIDIA GPU. It was basically just a computer. It ran a modified version of the Windows NT kernel. Like all of the other Xboxes, it was just a computer. However, the Xbox Linux team had some interesting ideas for how they're going to handle Microsoft. Here is an article from 2003. Xbox hackers attempt to blackmail Microsoft. A group says it can run Linux on Microsoft's Xbox and will make this technique public if Microsoft refuses to consider an official Linux bootloader. The researchers say they want Microsoft to release a signed Linux bootloader, which will allow Xbox users to run the open source operating system on the console without installing a chip. So at the time you did a load of mod chip, I believe it's a bit simpler nowadays, but at the time that's what you had to do. A signed Linux bootloader will not allow users to load pirated games, they say. Surely. However, the release of the new Xbox exploits they claim to have developed to run the Linux on the console would have the side effect of allowing rampant piracy without the need to install a mod chip, something the hackers say they would like to avoid. I'm sure they would like to avoid that. 100%. Ultimately, Microsoft basically just, said nothing. They're like, yeah, that's like the piracy division's part of the company. They never released the signed bootloader. Xbox Linux ended up just being publicly available, and that was basically the end of that. Whilst the original site has, long since gone down, there is an archive of everything that was happening there, so go to the Xbox Dev Wiki page. I'll leave it linked down below if you want to go check it out. Here is their newsfeed, their timeline, all that good stuff. And here are the historical distros that were also built around the Xbox Linux project. There are actually quite a few options at the time of pretty much all of the major distros. We've already established that the Xbox, not the first console with a Linux port. As I mentioned before, there's also the PlayStation 2, which came out a year prior, but the PlayStation 2 is actually a complete opposite situation to the Xbox. Whilst these hackers were like, ooh, Microsoft, you have to release a signed bootloader or we're gonna go and release the Xbox stuff and ooh, that's gonna be bad for you, Sony just said, okay, we're just gonna officially support Linux on the console. You could just buy a Linux CD for the PS2. That was just a thing. This was simply called PS2 Linux. Wow, I know, crazy naming. This was based on a Japanese fork of Red Hat Linux, not RHEL, this was pre-RHEL, Red Hat Linux, which is the predecessor to Fedora Linux, called Condara MNU Linux. There are a lot of really, really good videos on this project, so if you want to go check those out, sort of learn some of the history of what was going on there, be sure to go check those out. I'll leave those linked down below. If you look at this thumbnail, you might be able to tell what the desktop was. This was something known as GNU Step, an open source remake of NextStep. So NextStep was the Unix-based operating system used on the Next computers. Next was the company formed by Steve Jobs after he was kicked out of Apple. Now, even though the devices didn't sell amazingly well because they were really, really expensive, they became quite popular in universities and sort of defined a lot of the computing interface standards we have today Also, a lot of really important software was first made on one of these devices. For example, the World Wide Web by Tim Berners-Lee, the world's first web browser, and also Doom and Quake were first written for one of these devices. So a lot of people at the time were a big fan of the interface, and of course, there was going to be an open source remake of it. Being officially from Sony, there were going to be some limitations on what you could do with this Linux install, right? They didn't want you to go and start pirating PS2 games. Even though pirating PS2 games was, pretty simple anyway. The Linux kit turns the PlayStation 2 into a full-fledged computer system, but it does not allow for the use of the DVD-ROM drive, except to read PlayStation 1 and PlayStation 2 discs due to piracy concerns from Sony. Although the hard drive included with the Linux kit is not compatible with PlayStation 2 games, reformatting the drive with the utility disk provided with the retail hard drive enables use with PlayStation 2 games, but erases PS2 Linux. So you can have either the drive containing the games, or you can use the drive for Linux. You can't do both. However, since being long abandoned by Sony now, there have been a bunch of third-party continuation projects which are a lot more homebrew-oriented, unlocking the full power of the system, not having these kinds of limitations, letting you really do whatever you want with the PS2 system. And you can do things that I wouldn't necessarily call fun, but you can do them, like Gen 2. On a PS2. This is really well documented. Everything perfectly explained. It's going to take you a long time. Yes, you can compile the kernel on the PS2 once everything is sort of like bootstrapped and set up to do it. It's going to take you a long, long time, but it can be done. Here's just a random part. This is part 26 of, I don't remember how many parts, but yeah. Waste your time doing this if you feel like it. I did actually have Imolo on the podcast a few years back, so if you want to go see that and sort of learn about going and doing this, go check out that episode. Moving on from the PlayStation 2 to the following console, the PlayStation 3, at least initially, Sony took it considerably further. They had a feature called Other OS. So following boot, you could enable this feature and then just load any live CD you wanted. If you wanted to run Gentoo or Fedora or anything else that supported the PlayStation 3, you could just boot into that. You could then install it, and then when you boot, just boot into Linux. And not just Linux. Anything else that supported the PlayStation 3 was going to work. There was some BSDs and other things like that. This wasn't a hack. This wasn't an exploit. This wasn't accessing some sort of like developer mode that regular users weren't supposed to have. This was a feature directly available in the PlayStation 3. This had actually been used for some really cool projects, famously for a US Department of Defense compute cluster, a supercomputer you might say, made entirely of PlayStation 3s. The cell processor was a really weird processor. A lot of people wanted to see what could be done with it, and things like this were really what came of that. Now, there were some limitations due to the way they configured their hypervisor. I don't believe you were able to access the GPU, but even so, this was a really cool feature. So, following firmware update 3.21 on April 1st, 2010, which was a perfect time to do something really stupid, they decided, nah, just remove the feature. This ultimately resulted in a class action lawsuit, which, as is the case for class action lawsuits, didn't really resolve anything, and ended up in a settlement of $65 per affected person. As you might expect, if the PS1 could do it, kinda, and the PS2 could definitely do it, then pretty much every console following the PS2 is probably gonna have some form of Linux port. And from what I can tell, at least for the ones that anybody even remotely cared about, yeah, that is actually true. Even things which it probably shouldn't be done on, like the Nintendo DS. Yes, you can run Linux on a Nintendo DS. Should you? Probably not. Even though this is a cart-based system for a very long time now, there has been a way to load arbitrary software from a micro SD card, so that shouldn't be too surprising. And whilst there are still issues with it being done right now, and there's some work to make it happen, and it may not happen on every single firmware version, there is a port for the Nintendo Switch as well. Keep in mind, with anything that's a modern-ish generation console, patches are going to come out that break various things, so still a work in progress. Unlike, the PlayStation 2, which obviously didn't get patched, or the PS3, which pretty much, it actually still gets patched, but the patches are just to update the Blu-ray keys for the most part. Now, that raises an important question. What is the newest console with a Linux port? And once again, the answer seems to be a Sony console. However, unlike the earlier ones, not because Sony wants it to happen. So this guy by the name of The Flow, or Andy, I ported Linux to the PlayStation 5 and turned it into a Steam machine running GTA 5 Enhanced with ray tracing. This is still very, very early days. Things are going to keep breaking anytime a new exploit is found, but this specific version relies on an exploit from about 5 years ago. This is really common with early homebrew attempts, so expect that to be a little bit challenging for most people to do. He has been going and upstreaming some of the changes required to make this happen. It's still a mess, and most people shouldn't do this. Most people don't want to do this, but the fact that it can be done once implies that it can probably be done again, and there will come a point at some point in the future where this is going to be pretty straightforward to do, and you could just turn the PS5 into a really powerful system. Now, this isn't someone who just appeared out of nowhere and just randomly published this. This is someone who has been involved in doing PS4 and PSP and Vita and various other Sony hacking in the past. So this is someone who really knows what they're doing here. And I wish everybody else who might be involved in this project or various other similar projects the best of luck as well. Like I said earlier, if it can compute, someone will eventually try to run Linux on it. Even if the company may not be super happy about that happening, even if the hardware is kind of terrible and it shouldn't be done. Someone is gonna do it. So, let me know your thoughts down below. Is there any standouts that you think are really cool that maybe I missed? Do you know of some older projects that maybe I didn't see? I would love to know. So, if you liked the video, go like the video, go subscribe as well, and if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, subscribe, Silly Therapy, linked in the description down below. That's gonna be it for me, and they're all just computers anyway.
Something like this.